Most women are taught to read the light, the charming smile, the ambitious stride, the articulated future. They are trained from girlhood to search for the potential, to become the psychic archaeologist digging through the rubble of an immature man for the mythic king they believe is buried beneath. This is the fatal flaw of the feminine unconscious, the profound, often tragic, belief in her power to redeem. A woman's anima, the very soul of her being, carries an innate, almost unbearable burden of divine empathy. It whispers that her devotion is the crucible, her unconditional love the fire that will forge a true man from the raw ore of his immaturity. But this radiant fallacy is the very thing that chains her. The true path to sovereign femininity demands a far more difficult and necessary discernment, the ability to read the shadow, and to do so with a cold, clear, unmoved gaze. This is not about judgment, it is about psychological truth and self-preservation. It is about understanding that the energy you acknowledge is the energy you feed. The potential you seek to redeem is often the wound you condemn yourself to nurse. The Stoic masters understood this. Epictetus taught that we must not seek to bend the world to our desires, but to align our desires with the truth of the world. And the hard truth is that a man's shadow is his own solitary work. There are 7 seismic faults in the masculine psyche, 7 primal shadows that a woman must witness, acknowledge as fact, and then, in an act of profound self-respect and psychic individuation, refuse to claim or engage. The temptation is enormous. The ego, in its desperate need for significance, will always urge you to believe you are the exception, the one who can brave the darkness and return with the prize. But the woman who stands fully in her power does not seek to conquer a man's demons, she simply refuses to be consumed by them. She understands that her own shadow work is to stop seeking her own validation in the redemption of a fractured male soul. The first of these forbidden shadows is the boy king in the cave, the man who, despite the years on his face, remains psychically anchored to the protective, undemanding darkness of his adolescent ego. He presents the trappings of maturity, the career, the apartment, the smooth conversation, but beneath the surface, he is perpetually waiting to be rescued. This is the man who is charmingly irresponsible, whose failures are always externalized, whose emotional landscape is a temperamental wilderness requiring constant female appeasement. When a woman engages this shadow, she unconsciously steps into the role of the Great Mother, sacrificing her own sovereign purpose to regulate his unstable inner world. She becomes his psychic safety net, and in doing so, she aborts her own evolution. You see him perhaps when he speaks of his ex-partners, always as the villain who didn't understand, or when a minor setback sends him spiraling into self-pity, demanding the full and immediate focus of your emotional labor. To acknowledge this shadow means to see him not as a vulnerable creature in need of your warmth, but as a man refusing the burden of his own existence. He is rejecting the Senecan discipline, the necessary solitary labor of self-mastery and self-reliance. Your pity, your efforts to gently coax him into adult responsibility, are not acts of love, they are psychic endorsements of his perpetual immaturity. The woman of high self-worth does not debate his excuses. She simply registers the lack of authentic, self-generated momentum and understands that he is not a partner, but a dependent seeking a highly functional emotional nursemaid. The gaze must be cold, not cruel. It is the gaze of the conscious feminine, one that understands that the greatest act of love is sometimes the refusal to enable. You must see the cave he has built, and then turn your back on its entrance, walking toward the sun of your own individuated life. This is the first crucial test of your boundary, the initial separation of your fate from his projected deficit. The second psychic chasm, the shadow of the unlived life, manifests in the man whose soul is a graveyard of abandoned potentials and resentments, all carefully curated and blamed upon the external world. This man is a master of the projection mechanism. He walks through life burdened by the ghost of the man he could have been, and his immediate, unconscious imperative is to find a fertile ground, a female psyche, onto which he can transplant the thorny roots of his failure. You will observe this shadow in the corrosive pattern of passive sabotage, the subtle, often devastating way he undermines the vitality, the ambition, or the sheer joy of the woman who stands beside him. He cannot tolerate the sight of your becoming because it is a constant, screaming indictment of his own refusal to embrace the hero's journey. he cannot rise, so his unconscious goal is to subtly, sweetly pull you down. This is not overt abuse, it is the slow, insidious poisoning of inspiration. You might hear it in the backhanded compliment, the subtle discouragement dressed up as realism, or the sudden, unexplained moodiness that arrives precisely when you achieve a significant milestone. The woman who acknowledges this shadow, but chooses to engage it, becomes the target of his unacknowledged envy. She wastes years trying to reassure him of his own worth, believing that if she can just shine a little less brightly, he will feel safe enough to finally step into his own light. But Marcus Aurelius spoke of the need to protect the mind's inner citadel from the tyranny of external opinion. This shadow demands that you surrender your inner landscape to his emotional fragility. The true act of feminine sovereignty here is to see his envy not as a plea for help, but as a boundary violation. The woman of integrity refuses to dim her light for any man's comfort. She understands that his unlived life is not a space she is meant to fill, but a spiritual wilderness she must avoid entirely. Your responsibility is to your own flourishing. His is to face the consequences of his own choices. When you catch yourself explaining your ambitions less clearly, or wearing clothes that make you feel less vibrant, or moderating your joy to match his prevailing gloom, you have already ceded territory to this insidious projection. The third, a profoundly dangerous fissure, is the pauper of emotional wealth. The man who is psychically incapable of genuine reciprocity. He may be financially successful, articulate, or socially adept, yet his inner self is a barren land. He is the ultimate taker, not because he is necessarily malicious, but because his emotional maturity stalled at a stage of pure infantile demand. He views relationships not as a co-creation of shared meaning, but as a utility to service his needs, sexual, domestic, or egoic. His compliments are transactional, his affection conditional, and his capacity for true empathy, for genuinely holding the complexity of your pain or joy, is simply absent. The trap here is the woman's desire to earn love. She sees his emotional stinginess as a challenge, believing that if she just gives more patience, more understanding, more effort, she will finally unlock the hidden treasure of his feeling self. She invests years of emotional labor into a man who has already bankrupted himself. But this shadow cannot be paid off. His emotional pauperdom is a fundamental structural flaw in his own development, not a lock for you to pick. The forbidden gaze recognizes that a man's inability to meet you emotionally is not a reflection of your lack of worth, but a statement of his own profound scarcity. A woman's only defense against this shadow is the Stoic act of radical acceptance, accepting him as he is emotionally impoverished and refusing to allow him to spend your wealth. You must pivot from trying to give him what he lacks to preserving what you possess. Do not seek to fill his emptiness. Let his emptiness be the loud, clear signal for your decisive departure. The fourth shadow is perhaps the most insidious, for it is often mistaken for strength, the tyrant of the unexamined life. This man operates not through overt aggression, but through the unyielding rigidity of his ego. He possesses a deep, psychic aversion to introspection, to the messy, humbling, necessary work of self-inquiry. Everything in his life is compartmentalized, logical, and fixed. His opinions are iron laws, his routines sacred texts, and any challenge to his worldview is met with a cold, dismissive intellectualization that chokes the life out of genuine connection. He is the master of the subtle emotional control, using the weight of his certainty to invalidate the fluid, intuitive, and feeling-based world of the feminine. When a woman engages this shadow, she finds herself in a perpetual state of defense, constantly justifying her own subjective experience. She becomes a ghost in her own life, where her feelings are not data points to be considered, but anomalies to be corrected. The tyrant seeks to impose a purely masculine, rational structure upon her very soul, demanding that her vast, complex inner world be simplified into neat, manageable boxes that fit his limited view of reality. The spiritual danger here is the erosion of feminine trust in self. You begin to question your instincts, your joy, and your very sanity, believing that the fault lies in your inability to conform to his sterile order. This is the death of your anima's creative power. The forbidden gaze recognizes that this rigidity is not strength, but a deep, primal fear of chaos. The chaos that is necessary for growth, for transformation, and for the emergence of the authentic self. The man who refuses to look within is a man who is eternally brittle, destined to break, not bend. Your engagement with him will only ever be the agonizing attempt to introduce flexibility into the fundamentally inflexible. Stoicism, in its highest form, is not about emotional suppression, but about accepting what is outside of your control. And the inner landscape of another man is absolutely outside of your control. The woman of sovereignty must simply observe his unyielding resistance to shadow work and recognize that he will forever be incapable of the deep, soulful intimacy that requires vulnerability and mutable self-awareness. You must preserve the sanctity of your own feeling world and refuse to let his ego's prison become your own. Fifth on this somber list is the fallen idol of perfectionism, the man whose entire self-concept is built upon the fragile scaffolding of external approval and flawlessly executed performance. This shadow is not merely ambition, it is the terror of human imperfection projected outward. He lives in a state of perpetual low-grade anxiety, believing that any vulnerability, any failure, or any authentic emotional display will lead to his utter annihilation. His love for you is conditional upon your ability to uphold his flawless image, and he will subconsciously demand that you, too, become an extension of his performance, polished and unblemished. When a woman acknowledges and engages this shadow, she becomes a participant in his desperate charade. She sacrifices the spontaneity, the messiness, and the genuine humanity of the relationship for the sake of maintaining appearances. The emotional cost is immense. There is no safe harbor for her own failures or weaknesses, because he cannot tolerate them. They remind him too much of his own suppressed humanity. This man may be outwardly successful, but his inner world is a hollow, desperate place, forever seeking validation from the crowd. Your devotion becomes another trophy on his shelf, another proof of his worth. The forbidden gaze sees through the polished facade to the deep, screaming inadequacy underneath. It understands that this man's life is a performance, and the moment you need him to be authentically human, flawed, vulnerable, truly present, he will be unable to deliver. The ultimate act of detachment is realizing that his need for perfection is not a reflection of his high standards, but of his low self-worth. Your refusal to participate in the charade is the truest act of self-respect. The sixth primal fissure, and one that preys relentlessly on the compassionate feminine, is the ensnared victim of inherited trauma. This man is not simply wounded, he is psychically bound to the unhealed pain of his lineage. His behavior is a recurring loop of unconscious, ancestral reenactments, a man whose present relationships are merely a stage for the unresolved conflicts of his past. When he tells his story, it is always a narrative dominated by injustice, abandonment, or profound betrayal, and he carries this history not as experience he has integrated, but as a current, open wound. The peril for the woman lies in the deep, mythic resonance of the healer archetype within her. She looks upon his suffering and sees not a boundary, but a mission. Her heart aches with a desire to be the exception to his history, the woman whose pure love finally breaks the generational curse. She dedicates her vital energy to decoding his wounds, to anticipating his triggers, and to managing the erratic emotional fallout of his unprocessed past. She believes that her immense empathy is the key to his liberation. But the truth, the hard, crystalline truth spoken by every Stoic master from Seneca onward, is that virtue is a self-generated choice. You cannot choose healing for another. The forbidden gaze sees the inherited trauma not as a romantic depth to be explored, but as a psychic wall that he alone must dismantle. It understands that his loyalty to his pain, however unconscious, is stronger than his capacity for a healthy, forward-looking partnership. When you engage this shadow, you are not dating a man. You are joining a family saga of suffering, and you become the newest, most vigorous caretaker of a dynamic that predates your existence. Your acknowledgement of his pain must be detached, a recognition that his journey of individuation requires him to face his ancestors alone, without the crutch of your emotional labor. Your refusal to participate in the reenactment is not a lack of compassion. It is the highest form of respect for your own self-worth and a fierce declaration of your own right to psychological freedom. Finally, we arrive at the ultimate betrayal of self, the acknowledgement of the seventh shadow, the puppeteer of low-grade sadism. This man does not seek to dominate through physical force or screaming rage. he seeks to control through the deliberate, subtle infliction of emotional pain. His favorite tools are gaslighting, the calculated withdrawal of affection precisely when you need it, the casual cruelty disguised as teasing, and the strategic confusion designed to keep you perpetually off balance and yearning for his approval. His power lies in keeping you seeking external validation from the very source that is systematically draining your internal reservoir of self-esteem. This is the ultimate test of the sovereign feminine. When you look upon this shadow, you must realize that his behavior is not a plea for love, but an expression of profound, narcissistic emptiness. His need to diminish you is the only way he can temporarily elevate his own fragile ego. The woman who engages this shadow falls into the trap of becoming his mirror, desperately trying to reflect a version of herself that might finally earn his consistent kindness. She wastes her most precious resource, her unconditional love and respect, on a man whose unconscious motive is to prove, through her confusion and misery, that he is somehow superior. The forbidden gaze must be utterly clear here. Sadism, even in its low-grade, emotional form, is not a flaw. It is a fundamental refusal of humanity. It is the rejection of the logos of connection. To acknowledge this, shadow is to recognize that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, you can say or do to fix or redeem it. The only action is total psychological withdrawal. Your life is your most precious possession, and to remain is to consent to its slow, agonizing theft. Your liberation is found in the unshakable Stoic discipline of knowing your own value, independent of his opinion, and realizing that the profound stillness of solitude is infinitely preferable to the calculated chaos of his emotional manipulations. You must reclaim your projected power, turn inward, and seal the gates of your inner kingdom against his insidious influence. The only way to win this game is to simply refuse to play. The woman who has navigated these 7 shadows, not by fighting them, but by refusing to validate them with her energy or her presence, emerges not hardened, but integrated. She understands that the pursuit of a man's potential is a spiritual detour from her own destiny. Her worth is not measured by her capacity for rescue, but by her uncompromising adherence to her own highest self. She no longer seeks the external mirror of a man's love to confirm her existence. She stands, like Marcus Aurelius taught, in the secure knowledge of her own inner value. This is the profound, solitary work of individuation, the courageous, radical decision to be whole, irrespective of whether a man chooses to meet her there. Her power lies in her selective blindness, the refusal to acknowledge the darkness that does not belong to her. She reserves her gaze of acknowledgement only for the man who has already done the agonizing, necessary work of facing his own shadow, and who stands before her as an integrated, self-governed soul, ready not for rescue, but for true partnership. She is not seeking a man, she is seeking the reflection of her own achieved sovereignty. This is not the end of the journey, but the magnificent beginning of the sovereign feminine life.